All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for making this super early 8 a.m. meeting. Did you guys have a good time last night? Some good social events, good stuff, that's good. We're gonna be talking about delivering theme parks with BIM and really highlighting all of my mistakes and struggles that I've had, so feel free to laugh and throw stones. A little bit about me, CEO and president for Evolve Lab, OnPoint Scans, Disrupt Repeat, and then just recently started a nonprofit, Bare Roots Foundation. Kind of the running joke is like you start a company so you have like more free time and so you can set your schedule. It's not true, it's a total lie. It's like keeping me up at night and crazy stuff. So these are some of the things we're involved in, trying to do computational design, BIM consulting, scanning, things like that. If anybody's doing any tweeting, those are the Twitter handles right there for you at your convenience. Evolve Lab is a computational design BIM consulting company, building custom tools, trainings, workshops, things like that. Having a lot of fun here at AU, learning a lot from all the people here. It's really good stuff. Highlighting the client today, we're going to be talking a lot about DTJ Design. They're a client in Boulder, Colorado, my hood, backyard. They do a lot of really cool stuff in the architecture and landscape space. Probably one of the best landscape design companies I've ever seen. Really, really impressive stuff. Today we're going to be looking at understanding what challenges come with adopting BIM for unconventional projects, learning how to use multiple BIM platforms to synergistically overcome performance issues, learning how to capitalize on BIM for large unconventional projects, and learn what best practices exist for managing complex geometry. So, an introduction to this. I basically was getting beers with the principal at DTJ Design probably 4 years ago, and he's like, "Hey, Bill, we're getting ready to implement BIM in our firm." And I'm like, "Cool, I can help you out with that." He's like, "Yeah, we're trying to set up our Revit templates and content and start working on projects." I'm like, "Sweet, we can do that." So I went into the office and they were like, "Hey, we're doing this Revit implementation." And they started showing me the types of projects they worked on. And they're showing me these cupcake buildings and these crazy water slides and crazy mountains that they design. And I started like scratching my head and getting like super anxious and nervous. And I'm like, "Okay, can we start with like a multifamily? Like, can we do a townhouse? And they're like, "No, like these are the projects that have the budget, and we're gonna do it on this. Can you do it?" And I'm like, yes, I can do it." And in my head, I'm like, "How the hell am I gonna do this?" And so we started looking at it, these different projects, and starting to understand their process, interviewing their landscape team, interviewing their architectural team, and trying to see how we could start using BIM on some of these crazy projects. So this is a case study on different theme park projects that we've worked on with them. This first one is Chongqing Mayan Water Park. It's located in Chongqing, China. And this is kind of the finished product, some of the finished conditions that were taken, the photography that was taken. Some of the stats on it, it was 420 acres of theme park attractions. There was 160 meters of fall, like just let that sit in, like how much the grade dropped from one side to the other side. And it had the third largest wave pool in the world. And so like some of these statistics is like trying to manage this large of a project is just insane. Like it was the biggest project I've ever worked on in my life. And I've worked on some very, very large hospitals, stadiums, 4 million square foot hospitals, million square foot government facilities. But this was like to an entirely different level, just like super, super large project. And so a big thing for this was organization, like how we were gonna set it up, what was our model split strategy gonna be, how were we gonna do our BIM execution plan, all of this came into play. And so this is a site plan of the project, and they have various information going on. One of the hardest challenges with these types of projects is the integration of landscape, civil, rock work, ride attractions, and building geometry. Like integrating all of these things together is very, very, very difficult. And so throughout the project, we had this just massive challenge that we had to try to accomplish, not just from a modeling standpoint, but also a performance standpoint. Crazy enough, one of the weirdest like challenges that we had were just like simple CAD exports. Like I'm like, oh, easy, like we could totally do this, but there was some certain ways that the landscape team was used to working in AutoCAD with the architecture team. And so trying to just get exports to show up correctly, have certain information on, certain information off. Specifically, for those of you guys who are familiar with like the Revit view range, and you have this much grade dropped and different rock work, trying to set up like where the building exports were going to be set up for specific cut range was actually, weirdly enough, really, really challenging. So we had to like go through building by building, try to understand where they wanted to see rock work, interfacing with the building, making sure that those exports showed up correctly. So that was actually one of the challenges we had that I really didn't expect. The way a lot of these projects start is they start with a sketch. And these guys are some of the most talented artists I've ever seen in my life, just like these crazy sketches. And so they start with these sketches, and they put very detailed information, roof pitches, dimensions, theming comments, like things that they want incorporated into the project. And so our goal was to basically take any one of these sketches and Revitize them. So on the left, you have the sketch, and over on the right is that Revit building information model. Our process basically had to be very, very fast. These projects are very fast, have a very tight turnaround. And so what we would do is we would set up all these kind of, if you guys are used to this kind of post-processing process with Photoshop, we basically had a bunch of layers in Photoshop, and we would feed these artists the backgrounds, and then they would go through over on the Photoshop side and add people and entourage, things like that. One of the questions we kept asking ourselves is that there was so much art and decorative elements. So it's like, how much of this information do we want to Photoshop, and how much of it do we want to put in the building information model? So there was this constant tension of trying to think about, is it faster to just do it in Photoshop, or is it faster to start applying these type of materials and objects within Revit? With this process, basically we took a less is more approach, and what we did is we applied materials. So they had different art pieces that existed throughout the project, different sketches, and we started using decals to apply this. And just to give you guys a heads up, like this will get more progressive. Like this is the first one, we'll have 2 more. So what we tried to do is we said, okay, we have these different images and we want to apply that to the building. We started with decals. One of the challenges with decals is that if you have any kind of non-rectangular shape, you have like these black lines that exist outside of the building that would just be floating. And so that process fell short really fast. And so what we ended up doing was creating these different materials within the Revit library, and then basically painting the face on some of these. We also created a bunch of geometry as it related to sweeps and extrusions for roof pitches, as well as a lot of the columns. The other task that I was challenged with is going through and trying to create very kind of unconventional geometry. So I had to model this railing that existed throughout the whole project, and the Revit railing tool just wasn't going to cut it for these type of ornamental kind of balusters. And so going through creating line-based generic model families that were parametric, and then being able to apply those throughout the project was really, really critical. And so just using simple formulas with those was a process that we used, and then applying the materials in there and populating them throughout the project. We also did this with quite a few different decorative components, different fascias, things like that. I would create all these Revit families and then distributed them throughout the team, and then they would use them throughout the project, and then any questions that they had would try to help support them, make sure that they had it. So there's tons of different elements, decorative elements that existed, very unconventional, not your typical Revit roof, not your typical Revit fascia, etc. We also had to illustrate these elevations, and so going through the process, and this, by the way, was before Revit had the, what is it called, the view extents, where you can now change the fading, the gradient for all the imagery in the background. And so what we ended up doing was basically illustrating, cutting these as different elevations, bringing them into Photoshop, and then changing the transparency. Again, there's a lot of rock work, a lot of theming, a lot of entourage that existed with this. So it was a constant tension of like, what do we model and what do we Photoshop? This is an image of the building that had the third largest wave pool in the world. And through here, they had this stage and a bunch of functional information that existed in the back, like programmatic information as it related to how the function of the space was going to work, the staging, the theming, how the actors were going to come out, this massive TV that was going to be here. And so we had to go through and organize all of that as well with the various AV consultants. This is an example of some of the isometrics that we illustrated. We went through, and this is where I think this point really comes into play of like what you Photoshop versus what you put in the model. Because a lot of this information we wanted to show up in these views, but if we had to Photoshop this was just going to be a nightmare. It's also worth mentioning a lot of these projects only go through like schematic design, and then it gets handed off to an architect of record over in China, this one specifically. And so we were only going to take it so far. So we were trying to understand like how much time do we invest in modeling versus just letting it be translated over to the architects of record. So in this example specifically, you can see like if we were Photoshopping everything, it would have lost a lot of the value of these isometrics. And so we really wanted to try to make sure that we were using a modeling effort, applying materials, actually going through the effort and exercise of putting this information in the model so that that way we could get these type of isometrics. We used keynoting, we used tagging, we embellished data for all of the kind of smart documentation that you use with Revit for these projects. This building specifically was one that I had to work on. It had one of the largest grade drops, as I mentioned at the beginning, but this specific area was just insane. So that they had this massive escalator and then stairs, and so it was this huge drop from one side to the bottom. And so we had some really interesting like architecture that existed up on the top. And so going through this process, one of the challenges we had was, again, a lot of unconventional geometry. So we had these kind of these roof structures that existed over the escalator. And a process that I used a lot in hospitals, and you guys are probably used to it or know of it, but you basically create a conceptual mass family, and then you can make that parametric, bring that into your Revit model, and then you can go ahead and do a curtain wall by face, a curtain system by face. And so that was one of the processes that we used for modeling some of these structures, is actually using the Revit Conceptual Massing environment. I call that Autodesk's best kept secret. Even people that have been using Revit for like 10 years have no idea that that exists. And so for those that don't know, Revit Conceptual Massing environment. We also had all these kind of canopy shade structures, and we were trying to figure out, you know, the process for applying a lot of this imagery to these models. And so what we would do is we'd actually use a lot of the models in realistic view just for try to get the materials to show up. This posed a huge issue for performance challenges. Like the models got very, very slow, especially the size of these buildings, the files. And so we would constantly kind of go back and forth between like hidden line and realistic mode, trying to get the presentations, but also trying to model. And some of this stuff we had to see in realistic mode so we could model. So that became a really big challenge for us personally. The other thing is trying to get the materials to show up correctly on a face. And so you can see in the example of this canopy on the left here, we had, you know, the material is actually, the thatch roof is going the wrong direction. And so we would be able to, what I did is I just, even though we weren't using it in the presentations, I applied a pattern for when it was set to hidden line in the materials. And then you can go ahead and click on that grid system, rotate it, and then it rotates your material for your realistic view as well. So that's you know, a little nugget that was really helpful for us on this project. We also had like these crazy columns, like these guys that were holding corn and diamonds and all kinds of crazy stuff. And I was trying to figure out like how in the world are we going to model, you know, some of these decorative elements as well. the way that we did that, specifically on this project, is I used the wall profile tool. And so what it gave us is, these cutouts basically is a very, very tedious process. And I'll show a better way to do this in a little bit here. But basically what we did is we did a wall profile and then cut it out, applied the material to it, and then that gave us our elevations and our isometrics. For this part, we had to go through detailing, dimensioning, documenting this information. You'll notice that there's Chinese translations in here as a Chinese client. And so we also had to have a translator on the project helping us take all of the documentation and translate it to Chinese. Side note, again, a lot of things like I didn't expect to happen is that Revit also struggles a little bit with some of these type of symbols, specifically from a formatting standpoint. And so that was also a major challenge, is like trying to find fonts and trying to get formatting correct so that way this information showed up correctly. The other big value add, of course, with Revit and BIM is the data. And so this client specifically, when they would go through this process, I mean, they have like thousands of lockers, like in this massive water park. I mean, think of when you go to your water park in your home city, just like the lockers that exist. When you start talking about 420 acres of theme park attraction, there is just like thousands of lockers, there's thousands of plumbing fixtures, there's thousands of spaces of just like uses. And so when we were going through this, what we really wanted to push, and I was pushing them, is like we absolutely have to leverage, like the Revit data in here. As a side note, the way we set up this project is we set up all the buildings as separate Revit files and then link them into a master site file. That is the best way, and I'll give an example of how not to do this in a little bit. But basically, any of this information, this has to exist in your master file, so that way when you link all of these together, you get all the data from all the buildings. We also use Dynamo quite extensively on the project. As a side note, I've chatted with a few people here already at the conference, and they were like, well, isn't Dynamo just for like twisty towers and crazy bridges? I strongly recommend, if you guys have not yet attended any Marcelo's classes on Dynamo, he shows some very, very good practical uses for Dynamo. With that, we've used Dynamo to leverage just a lot of grunt work, sheet creation, view creation, automating the CAD exports. Going through the process, one of the other things that we did is with the grade change on this building, with these building files and all the elements that were associated to it, we had a lot of people that would put information on wrong levels. And so going through and having to remove levels and move the elements to different levels, there's no tool in Revit that says, hey, what elements exist on this level? With Dynamo, you can do that. And so with Dynamo, I always say Dynamo is one of those things that you can start bending the rules of Revit. If you can't do it in Revit, often you can start leveraging Dynamo to be able to do what you want it to do or get the information that you want to get. So this was the first project that we did for DTJ Design, and it was the Chongqing project. The second one we did was this Leyenda Del Mar water park. This is in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. And this project was really unique and challenging for multiple reasons. One, it had even more like unconventional geometry. Like there was this massive ship that was in the center. Instead of just having like a Mayan theme, it had 3 different themes. And so where before we were able to take, some of these Revit families and some of the information and populate them throughout all of the buildings, now we had to start creating unique theming families for all these different elements for different parts of the site and starting applying it to those. So the three themes that this one had was this lost civilization, it had the Kaohsiung secret wharf, and then the land of legends. So these are the different themes that existed and how we had to start thinking about organization of the project, how we were going to interface with the landscape and civil team, how we were going to interface with the ride consultants, as well as how we were going to actually structure the content for this project. And so this one, they came to us and started showing me some of this imagery. So I was like, oh my goodness, how in the world are we going to do this? So shout out to Paul Alban too. He has a really good class on designing classical architecture. We ended up buying his book when we were working on this project, and that was super helpful. As a side note, there's a lot of like really smart individuals here at this conference and people that I strongly encourage you guys to network with. Because things happen like this where it's like, man, how are we gonna do this? Oh, well, I ran into Paul and he has this book and I took his class 2 years ago. There's a lot of really good resources here, and so that's one of the resources that we used for this project specifically when we started thinking about this. This one had a similar approach. You guys will notice a common theme, no pun intended, where they have, some of you got it. So we have these sketches that exist. The architect would go ahead and sketch these out, the designer, and then we had to basically Revitize that information. So again, this is kind of the process. And their comment was that the computer just doesn't move fast enough for them. When they're designing and they have this creative spirit, they really want to be able to just pen to paper. They also use these Wacom tablets where they sketch digitally, and then we bring that information in as well. And so this is an example of the sketch on the left, and then us basically trying to Revitize the information over on the right. This is some of the classic architecture that we started modeling. Basically used a series of sweeps and extrusions, really leveraging the array tool, starting to think about the different components that needed to be arrayed around the different dome structures, the columns that existed. There was a lot of really kind of decorative information that existed with a lot of these projects that we had to go through and model. And the other thing that we really wanted to push is like with the last project, the Mayan water park, we didn't want to just do a series of wall profiles. We wanted to really try to push the limits and see what we could actually do with the program. And so for this one, I'll show some examples of that. But again, basically just using a series of sweeps and arrays. When you think about some of these structures, like when you take a step back, they look very complex, but when you break them down piece by piece, they're really not that complex. As an example of this one, really all we're doing is we're creating an extrusion and then we're arraying it around, or we might create a profile for this sweep and then array that around. So really when you are thinking about how to model some of this stuff, if you can really break it down into a kit of parts that you can go ahead and utilize, starting to replicate that around, that's basically the process that we use for a lot of these type of structures. This one we definitely, instead of just using Revit, we wanted to try to leverage other programs for their different uses. And different programs are better for different things. And one of the things we did is we used the topography from AutoCAD, the civil engineer and the landscape group. They would do all of their design in AutoCAD. And then what we would do is we would go ahead and bring that information into SketchUp to be able to start extruding. So like this rockwork here as an example. We would extrude the rockwork from the AutoCAD file. Then we would bring it into Mudbox and kind of sculpt it to kind of give it that kind of rocky fill and shape, and then bring that into Revit. For those that don't know, Mudbox is really what a lot of the designers use for theming of different elements, specifically in like video game design and other things. It kind of gives you more of like a sculpting type of feel with some of these programs. And so again, Revit is a building information modeling program. It's not necessarily a rockwork, modeling program or a Mayan god like modeling program. So what you want to think is trying to think about like how you can start leveraging some of these other programs specifically for what they're good at. And that's what we specifically try to do on this project. Again, we used a lot of parametricism with a lot of the components. We were able to go ahead and drive these, using different radii, profiles, different rigs that we could go ahead and model and edit parametrically. But then the other thing that we did is we had different type selectors. So we'd have like nested families. So you'd have like your column family, and then we would nest the top or the base, and then you would be able to swap out that type of capital element up at the top or different elements at the base. So going through modeling a lot of this kind of like, again, as a kit of parts that could be replicated throughout the project, and then you can easily swap those in and out by using the type selector and nested families. This one was interesting. So they're like, cool, like we want to model a ship. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So trying to think about how we would be able to model a ship and I was just chatting with, shout out Steve Michele. Steve Michelle's in the house. Steve, can you raise your hand? So Steve's doing some really cool stuff, but we're looking at trying to model, different ships and other information as it relates to the Revit model. There's no ship category in Revit. And so like the most abused categories that exist in Revit is specialty equipment and generic models, right? A lot of head nods. So one of the challenges we were trying to think is like, how do you categorize this information? How do you schedule this information? What information is repeatable versus like as an in-place family? So as an example, obviously, like you don't want to like make a locker an in-place family something that's repeatable, a lot like the columns. Those are things that you want to be able to model as a family that is not an in-place family, like a system family or a category family. So a lot of the ships and other kind of specialty information that existed just in one location, we ended up just using typical sweeps and extrusions to model those, and we basically put them under the generic model category because there really wasn't, a better category to put them in. I think the other thing too is I feel like the void tool in Revit is completely underutilized. There was a really good class probably 6 or 7 years ago here at AU that I took called Into the Void. Phil Reed taught it, really good class, and it talked about how to leverage the Revit void tool for different elements. And so you could go through and model, say the ship sail as a solid extrusion, but then could then go through and use the void tool to go ahead and cut the information out. So these are some of the tools that we actually ended up modeling a ship in Revit, which is just crazy to me, but that's how we did it. Again, the other thing, we didn't want to just use the wall profiles for the columns. We wanted to try to have some kind of three-dimensionality for some of these sculptures. And so this was one of the things we really wanted to say, okay, if we're issuing these isometrics or renderings, how do we model, this information? How do you model a dress? How do you model a hand? These are things that are really, really challenging to do. And we ultimately came to the conclusion that Revit probably is not the best program for this. And so what we ended up doing is basically Frankensteining a lot of these parts. We would be able to grab different elements that existed either online or model it ourselves. And we either used Mudbox or 3ds Max or SketchUp and modeled it through those programs. And the white paper really shows extensively this process. I don't think it's a good use of our time of me to read all these bullets and every click and pick on how to do this. But in the white paper, I do go through systematically of how you can go through and clean a lot of these up. The point being on a lot of this is 3ds Max really became our tool to interface before we brought it into Revit. That was the tool that we used to clean up the edges, because if you don't do that, one, it triangulates it. It looks like it does over here on the left. The other thing is that you run into serious performance issues as well. And so we ended up going through this kind of tedious process, but it was really, really helpful to get us to this end result of actually being able to bring this information into Revit as a real Revit element. We also had a series of decorative details, and these basically weren't so parametric. I think the other thing is, like, for me personally, I'm uber nerdy, and I can just want to like parameterize everything. And so like sometimes just like taking a step back and thinking about, is it a good time, like a good use of my resources and time to spend the next 6 hours parameterizing, this decorative detail? It wasn't. So just trying to think about that as well as, trying to put the right resources where they need to be. The other major challenge we had on a lot of these projects were these ride towers. So a lot of these projects, we're not designing the rides. It's a ride consultant. And you have someone like ProSlides or someone like that that goes through and designs these ride towers. Well, they design the rides. We design the ride towers. And so the challenge with this, similar to the manufacturing world, is a lot of these people, they're using their drawings for fabrication of the slides and the different rides. And so they're modeling like every stinking nut and bolt, just like a manufacturer does. And as you guys know, like that's not really good for the building information model, especially from a performance standpoint. And so what we basically did is we went through this similar process that we did with the columns of starting, a lot of their files come in from SketchUp. And so we would go through this process of exporting the files from SketchUp to 3ds Max, going through a series of these clicks and picks for the ride towers, and then bringing the information in as native Revit geometry. Again, I don't think it's a super good use of our time to like talk about every one of these clicks and picks, but the punchline for this is really just trying to make sure that we clean up the files so that way they can become usable in the Revit model. I know like prior to going through this process, we would bring in a SketchUp file from the ride consultant, and it would just be like a good like 2 minutes just to link it in and then panning around. It was a huge time suck. So even though it might take us, 30 minutes to clean up a ride file, it's definitely better for the longevity of the project. And this is kind of showing like the information inside of Revit as like real Revit categories, these different subcategories that exist as their geometry. Another thing that we tried to do on this project, and I'm still trying to figure out if it's a good process or not. I'm not sure. I'm still figuring it out. But we basically have, throughout the project, the same building, but it has different themes. And so it's a project where, or a building where it might serve as like a locker room and a tube rental or a restaurant. And so a lot of this information, the floor plan is exactly the same, replicated 27 times throughout the project. But then if it's in, the Kaohsiung Wharf area versus the other part, there's information, the theming needs to be different. So basically what we did is we modeled all of the information that is static or doesn't change in Revit in the main model, and then we used design options and put this information on its own design option, and then linked that into the various files and then changed which design option you wanted to see. The reason I'm not totally sold on this process yet is because the theme is based on its location, and every single view that is looking at this building file, you have to tell it that it's that theme. So if you're in your floor plan, you have to change it to that design option. When you're in the elevation, you have to change it to that design option. And so like it becomes kind of this inconsistency that could exist versus, well, it's just this file. Of course, the other challenge is if all of these are separate files, then you're chasing it and updating 3, 4, 6 different types of buildings, even though they're all the same floor plan. So it's a little bit of give and take of trying to do, everyone always asks me, like, what's the best way to do this? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, there's pros and cons to all of this stuff. And so sometimes you have to think of like a weighted pro and con matrix of like, well, you have these benefits, but then you have these cons if you do this approach. So again, a lot of this stuff, I'd love to chat with you guys over a beer and see like if you guys have a better idea for some of these type of building files and a way to do it. But this is how we did it on this project. It seemed to work pretty good. Overall, I was pretty happy. You just have to be really diligent about going to your views and updating them. Okay. This one is a confidential water park, and I can't say who the owner is, and I can't say where it's at. But I did get, or what it looks like. This is it. This is the file right here. So this is the project. We'll call it Exhibit A. And so basically, again, just a lot of building elements existed throughout the site. But specifically, this was the most recent one. And they're like, cool, guys, like you did these other 2 projects. We want to model a mountain. And we have these wave pool attenuators and storage, and we have paths coming in and out of here, and we have waterfalls, we have structure, and they wanted to take this all the way through and wanted to think about like how that was going to happen specifically from a construction documentation standpoint. And so this project, in a sense, we tried something different, and honestly, to be completely honest, I have no idea why we did it this way. At some point, we decided that we were going to document a lot of this information in the site file. And so this is an example of what not to do. So we had all these, they were still all separate Revit files, like separate Revit building files, but we started thinking about if you could start going through and using linked views for the site file and just doing all of your documentation in that site file. This became a big mistake. As we started going through the process, the linked views became corrupt. We started getting really inconsistent results. Again, there was a lot of performance issues. And so this is an example of like what not to do. And we strongly recommend documenting everything within your respective building file, and the only documentation you ever bring into that site file is your overall site plan and any kind of information you want to schedule. So big lessons learned on this one of what not to do. Again, there's a lot of architecture on this one, a lot of integration with rockwork. We had these crazy mountains, and we wanted to try to experiment with a different way of doing this. And so part of our scope was, to locate major elements within this model, or within the mountain, to do conflict resolution, clash detection, with the different aquatic vault, the back of house programmatic elements. We had to have a 1 meter clear between the rides and the vaults. There's been a lot of stories of people riding rides and putting their hands up, and if you don't have, so even though the roller coaster, may fit through there, hands may not. Get the point, yeah, read between the lines. So you have to make sure that also, you have some kind of clearance between some of those as well. The other challenge we had too was like paths and points of access for this specific project. So this one, we decided to try to do it computationally. We had a lot of kind of organic rock work, and we were also going to be having some updated mountain chains. So the landscape civil group, we're still working on the mountain, but we had to start modeling it. And so in our minds, what we thought, we were like, and for those that haven't used Grasshopper or Dynamo, just to kind of give you a point of reference here, on the left, what we could do is we could start referencing their 2D information, the perimeter of the mountain. And so in here, you use this process called set curve, and then you can extrude that up. So then as the landscape team continues updating their backgrounds, you link it in, and it updates your mountain, the extrusions that go up vertically. And so through that process, that was kind of our logic for using this. Also, we wanted to try to push the limits of designing it parametrically. I think another example of like what not to do is I think we took it too far computationally. Again, the ditch I can fall into is like, well, let's just keep going, building more scripts and building more components to this computational effort. And so at some point, you have to stop doing that and go, what is your end result? And so I think that's another lessons learned that we had is we probably took this too far on the Grasshopper computational side of things. As a side note, it looks really cool, like a gnarly Petri dish. If you guys are used to like this is like, it was really kind of interesting from a plan view. But the thing that it really helped us from the color standpoint is to understand like the elevation. So like when we're doing contours, typically you have a elevation that exists on a contour. Actually showing the gradient colored was like super helpful for us to understand elevations of the mountain specifically. The other thing we had to do is to get quantities. So this is like a 3D representation of the mountain, the structure, and they wanted to ask us what was the mass of the volume of this mountain. And so the other thing that Grasshopper was really, really instrumental is you can get that with this type of geometry. You can actually get the mass information, which in my knowledge you just simply can't do with Revit out of the box. You'd have to use possibly Dynamo to get the volume of it. But we ended up doing it with Grasshopper and getting the quantities for the mountains. That way they understood from a cost perspective how much quantity of mountain they were going to have for whatever material they were going to use. One thing we did try to do is try to take a leaner approach. They were talking about, moss and waterfall features and all kinds of interesting elements that were going to be a part of this mountain. And so, again, of taking kind of the less is more approach, we ended up just taking a bitmap of this kind of rocky, grassy terrain and applying it to the mountain. We had a series of cave penetrations that we had to coordinate as it related to all of the programmatic information in here. There was, like I said, a wave pool attenuator. We had to coordinate the mechanical information inside of here, as well as a lot of the egress information. So in here, there's a series of paths that went throughout the mountain, but as well as throughout the project. And specifically, it was interesting because this team used to use kind of a 2D process to coordinate, egress and paths and things like that. And as we started modeling the mountain, they would go, cool, like here's the sketch, go model it. And then we'd go, hey, it doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? Well, here, look at this pathway and then this ride that comes in over on this side and this wall setback. And so looking at it in 3D really, really helped with a lot of the functional information as it related to paths and egress specifically. This is probably my favorite image of all time. So the other thing we wanted to try to do was to show functionality of the mountain from the different tiers, the different levels. We had back of house, we had restaurants, we had slide attractions. We had just tons of information that was going on inside of this mountain. And so from a coordination standpoint, it was really important, but then also just communicating function of spaces was really important. And so what we ended up doing was creating a series of section boxes throughout the mountain. And we were able to go through, basically create 4 separate views, section box those through, and then overlay that with some line work. So it's actually pretty simple when you break it down, but it produced some really, really incredible imagery, in my opinion. And I think this is one of the other things that you just don't get, like in a 2D process. I know many of us have been in Revit and BIM for a long time, but this is just like another point of just showing like the function of a model and how you could start leveraging. Because if you were to do this, as a sketch in, say, SketchUp or an AutoCAD, like it would take forever to model all of this information, especially in this kind of context. But with Revit, you could just cut your sections and you have that information. So after we did these three theme park projects, we were like, okay, none of these had a template. Like we came in, I built out all the Revit templates for the commercial side, the residential side. They ended up using Revit for more traditional architecture as well, not just their theme park projects. But we wanted to think about like what goes in a theme park template. And so like one of the things that we took into consideration was a lot of like performance information. So we had model maintenance data, like when was the last time the project had the warnings reviewed, when was the last time it was audited or purged or compacted, or when the central files were created. So we started creating a log of that information, as well as who was managing that model. We also had the design team information, so if you had the ride consultants or anybody that was from the landscape group, what is their contact information? This was the landing page, by the way, for when you opened it. So trying to have very useful information on that landing page, project status, client name, etc. And then the project browser. The other thing we started having this debate with was the file organization, right? Like, are we setting these up by building, by zone? Obviously, the campus approach wasn't a good way to document it. And so we were having conversations. Basically, we set it up by building for each individual file, and then you would have certain information associated to that building, then linked into a campus model overall. As a conclusion, the lessons learned that we had were to find ways to model elements lightweight. Taking the less is more approach, cleaning up the files prior to bringing it in for documentation. That was a big lessons learned for us. Documenting the buildings in their respective files, their zones, not in the site file, was a really important lesson learned. The caveat, again, being that any elements that need to exist in that master file, such as programmatic data, that information needs to be in the overall campus/site model. Using multiple software platforms synergistically to improve the performance for complex vertices, and then also leveraging the right tool for the right job to accomplish specific tasks, such as the parametric modeling, knowing when to stop. Those were all kind of big lessons learned for these various projects. I'm going to open it up for questions. Before I do that, I just want to remind everybody that to fill out surveys, these are really, really important for all of us, for us to be, whether or not we get invited back again next year. So really would appreciate any surveys that could get filled out. But before that, I want to ask if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask. Yes, sir.
Do you have any structural engineers involved in these projects? Some ideas of how they're going to build?
Yep. So I'm going to repeat the question. I forget we have our handy-dandy microphone. But the question was, did we have any structural engineers involved in the project? On these ones, we did not specifically. And that poses a significant challenge, specifically if you're thinking about the mountain and egress, what happens when there's a column in the middle of the pathway. So specifically on these ones we didn't, but it was going to get handed over to someone that was going to coordinate the structural elements. They had their own BIM consultant, the owner did, that was going to coordinate the structural columns as well as all the other information from a coordination standpoint. But a lot of the buildings too, with the exception of the mountain, are like one story. And so the structure of them aren't that super complex. And so that's how we were able to kind of execute it without a structural engineer, at least through schematic design. Yes, Steve?
How did you budget your time to estimate how you would charge your client on something like these?
Yeah, so I've kind of changed the way that we budget it. We used to do kind of like an hourly, time for the project, and we were just an extension of the project, just like their staff was. And so we were just charging an hourly amount, but we would say, hey, we're going to be in the office 3 days a week, 4 days a week for the next 3 months, and then that would aggregate their total. For the mountain, we actually had a fixed fee, so we had an end deliverable, and then we had a fixed fee for that deliverable of the mountain. So it's a risk game. It's like, does the client take the risk? Do we take the risk for fees? And so we kind of have changed it up a little bit depending on the application.
Yeah, it looked like most of your scope was with architecture and structural. Did you get involved with MEP at all?
No, so a lot of these projects, because again, I don't agree with this, but there's a lot of them were taken through schematic design, and there's a big push to try to get MEP and structure involved earlier. This client specifically does these theme park projects, and they don't have any MEP in-house. For their more traditional projects, they do use MEP consultants, but a lot of these theme park projects are overseas. Specifically, all of these were in China and Taiwan. So these projects specifically, they're going to have their own MEP consultant that's going to pick it up in DD and take it all the way through. It's worth mentioning that there's another project that I wanted to show you guys that I did not get permission to share. And there's one, I don't even think I can say where it's at, but they have another project that they're taking all the way through construction documentation. And they're currently, we're working on that with them right now as we speak. In that one, we do have MEP consultants and structural consultants, because they're going to take it from schematic all the way through CD and CA. So really good questions. Other questions you guys have? Yeah, so I'll repeat the question because we're being recorded. So the question is, and correct me if I misspeak, but the question is considering it's going through CD and CA, construction administration, would we consider changing the way we model information or set up the project? The answer is absolutely. So now we're starting to think about specifically not just programmatic and equipment data, but how are we going to document the windows? How is the door schedule going to be executed? How are we interfacing with consultants, and what is their scope versus our scope? Those are all things that are really being taken into consideration as it goes through the construction documentation and administration stage for sure. Yep, yeah, maybe round 2, part 2. Yes, sir.
What was your deliverable to the scenic vendor, the scenic consultant? So people that are building all those sculptural elements, are you handing off a model or Revit package, or is it a lot of that artwork and then they take it and build their own shop drawings from there?
Yeah, so interesting enough, a lot of overseas clients are still using AutoCAD. And so a lot of times contractually, the deliverable is AutoCAD and SketchUp. So they specifically are asking for an SKP file and a DWG file. Out of convenience, we were like, hey, we think these files actually would be of use to you. So we actually ended up sending them like the SAT file from the Rhino model, as well as all of the Revit model information as well. So that way they could use that as well. So I think the international clients are still trying to catch up to the rest of the industry. And so even though they may not have it as in their contract, we still think it's useful for their process. So trying to over-deliver. Also, a common element, the first project, taking that through schematic design, a lot of people were asking, well, did we over-deliver on that? Is that a schematic design model or not? And so that's another question that we had as it relates to, well, what are we delivering? What is our scope? And even though we can do it, should we do it? Does the fee allow us to do it? And so that was another challenge and tension that we had of, what should we be giving someone? And frankly, we more than times over-delivered, like more than we should have. But it's one of those things that we felt like it's good for the project and good for the client, so. And
good marketing.
Yeah, it's good marketing, yeah, so. Other questions? Yes, sir?
Do you have a BIM execution plan for this project?
Yes, so the question was, did we have a BIM execution plan for the project? We did. We had a BIM execution plan. We had a BIM kickoff meeting. A lot of this information, again, was more schematic, computational modeling. Most of them weren't going all the way through CA. So a lot of the information that's typically like in your Penn State BIM execution plan and others wasn't necessarily material to the project, but we did definitely have a plan of attack of how we're going to execute this. The other thing that we really tried to practice when we did this first project and then we did the second one and third one, this is just common knowledge, like you should absolutely do this whether you're doing theme parks or hospitals or single family residential houses, is to say we would have in our BIM kickoff meeting, we would say, what are our lessons learned? What bit us in the butt on that last project that we can make sure that that doesn't happen again in this future project? So that was part of our BIM kickoff meeting as well. Yes? Yes, so the question is, did we count faces? Is there anything in Revit that would help us count faces as it relates to some of the columns and other things like that? We didn't try to count faces, but we did just try to clean up the models, try to make them less complex, less triangulated, the information both from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a performance standpoint of trying to clean up a lot of that information. Not necessarily counting it, but cleaning it up. Cool. Well, appreciate your guys' time. Thanks so much. Again, if you could fill out the survey, appreciate that. Thanks.